Welcome to today's Torah portion, Vaetchanan. And Vaetchanan means, and I pleaded. So this is the story how Moses speaks to the fact that he really wanted to enter into the promised land, although the Lord had already told him he was not going to enter the promised land because of the sin of Meribah. And so he couldn't come in, but yet he still pleaded. The Gematria tells us by the number of 515, which is the numerical value of Vaetchanan, and the sages liken this to the fact that they say that Moses pleaded 515 different ways and times to ask the Lord to please let him come into the promised land. Well, that may be so or it may not be so. We don't know, but it gives a light to the fact that Moses had an incredible desire and pleaded with the Lord to come in. So pleading with the Lord doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get what you're asking for, but the fact that you're pleading shows that you are in the Lord's presence and you believe the Lord. You believe the Lord can do what you're asking for, or you wouldn't be asking, right? So an example of this is in Luke chapter 7 and verse 3, and it's about the centurion. When he heard about Jesus, this is verse 3, he sent elders of the Jews to him and pleading with him to come and heal his servant. So the fact that this centurion pleaded for the Lord to come and heal his servant shows that he believed. He believed because he pleaded. And he pleaded because he believed. Now, in 2 Corinthians 5:20, it says, "Now then, we are ambassadors for Messiah." Let me just stop here and just say, he's speaking this verse to all of us who are believers, who are followers, who are born-again followers of Yeshua, or Jesus, that we are ambassadors for him. We are supposed to be his emissaries, you could say, here on this earth until he returns, to bring the light, to bring the truth, to bring the words to others and to each other. And so he says, we are his ambassadors, as though God were pleading through us. We implore you on Messiah's behalf, be reconciled to God. So I just find it very interesting that in this instance, Paul is speaking to the fact that God pleads with us. He pleads through us. He pleads through us to use us to speak his truth to others. Now, obviously, the Lord doesn't have to do this, but he chooses to do it. So we are being enlisted, I guess you could say, enlisted by the Lord to plead in his behalf. And what a wonderful privilege and honor to think that our Lord does this through us. 2 Corinthians 10:1, "Now I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Messiah." So it's a kind of an example, wouldn't you say, that this is how we should be with others, that we should plead with them in God's behalf, but also do it in kindness and in meekness so that the Lord could be honored through our lives. Now I want to give you a parable of the unjust judge. This is what the name of the parable is known as, the parable of the unjust judge, and it's found in Luke chapter 18 and beginning of verse 1. So I'm going to read it and then just briefly speak about it. "So then he spoke a parable, he being Yeshua, to them, his disciples, that men always ought to pray and not lose heart, saying, There was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him, saying, Get justice for me from my adversary. And he would not for a while, but afterward he said within himself, Though I do not fear God, nor regard man, yet, because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she wearies me. Then the Lord says, Hear what the unjust judge says." So it's the idea that this widow it's not because she has money, or not because the judge fears God, as it says, or he doesn't even care about man. He's just not a very good person, it looks like. And yet, he is going to avenge this woman, not because of any other reason except the fact that she continually pleads before him. She continually comes before him, and basically she's just wearing him out. So in order to get rid of her, so to speak, he does what she asks. And that's a point that the Lord is wanting us to hear also, that we need to continue to plead so that God does for us what we ask. And again, not necessarily that God's going to give you what you ask for, but if you plead long enough and you see what happens, then you realize you really do receive God's answer. And if you don't plead, then you don't necessarily know if this was what God wanted or not. But if you plead before God about something, then what comes is what God mostly wants. In verse 7, it says, "And God shall not God avenge his own elect, who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them?" And Jesus says, "I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth?" And why would Yeshua ask this? It's very strange that he throws this in at the end of this parable of basically teaching that we need to plead to God. We don't just need to be haphazard or just slow of speech. We need to be, constantly in the Lord's face. And isn't that what we want to be? Don't we want to be constantly in front of him? And so that's what he says. That's where your answers come from being in this constant presence with him. And then he adds, "But will the Lord really find faith when he comes?" And so again, it's a very strange thing. But if you continue in this chapter, then you get the answer of why he asked that question. So in verse 9, "So he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector." So he's given us another parable right immediately after that parable to give the answer of why he asked the question about faith. So these 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, which means he was very religious, and he dressed the part, he acted the part, all these things, but yet we don't know his heart. Only God knows. And then the other man was a tax collector. And if you know anything about the New Testament, you know that tax collectors were not just not liked, they were actually despised by their own people. Why? Because it's not like taxes today where you pay your taxes to our federal government or your local government or your state government, whatever. It's your government. But you see, in this time of the writing of the stories here, Judaism and the Jewish people weren't paying taxes to their own people. They were paying taxes to Rome. They were being occupied by Rome. So to work as a tax collector meant you were working for the enemy. You're working for Rome. So you can see why a tax collector would not be well thought of. We can at least say it that way. Now, it says, "The Pharisee stood and prayed with himself, 'God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector.'" Now, can you imagine? He is talking about all these evil people, and then he probably looks at this tax collector and probably doesn't even try to hide what he's saying. He probably wants the tax collector to hear it. He said, "And I'm not even like this tax collector." And then he goes on to brag on himself. "I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess." And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Now you see, that answers the question, would he find faith on the earth? And the faith is going to be found in those who realize they have nothing to offer God. There is nothing in and of themselves that they can do, that they possess, that comes out of them, that anything. There's nothing about them that is making them worthy to even speak to God. But those who would humble themselves and believe that God can do mighty works in their lives and forgives them for their sins, those are the ones the faith will be found. So, of course, when the Lord comes, he will find faith on the earth. He asks a rhetorical question to give then the answer. Now, we move to Matthew chapter 26 and verse 36. Now, we've been talking about the fact that we should plead. We should plead before the Lord. And now we're going to move in this verse of scriptures here about how the Lord himself pleaded with the Father for his own behalf. And so in verse 26, chapter 36, Matthew 26:36, then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to the disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. He went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Now, before we go further in this little story here, I think it's very interesting and important that you know that word, this garden, called the Garden of Gethsemane, which you can still visit to this day. The Garden of Gethsemane means in English, if you would translate it into English, would mean oil press. So here he is in this garden where there would be found an oil press, which is actually an olive press. It would be where the olives were pressed for the oil to come out of them. But first of all, understand that first olives are pressed. The stone rolls over them and presses the oil and basically crushes. So first thing that happens is the olives are crushed. And it's a total and complete picture how Yeshua was crushed for us. This weight of sin broke him. He was broken. And even when he would hold the bread at that Passover meal, he broke the bread, symbolizing what was about to happen to him, that he was going to be broken for the sins of the world. Not just for their sins in that room, or the sins for the people out of the room, but the people for all of history that would come to him and trust him. The sins were being paid for on that Passover for them. And this picture of the oil press and the pressing and the crushing of the olives. And then after olives are pressed or are crushed, I'm using the same two different words for it, and there are two different actual things. First, the olives are crushed, means they're broken and the seeds are even crushed along with them, and then they're pressed. Then they would take the olives and press them and squeeze the oil out of them. And that's exactly what happened to Jesus. He was crushed and then he was pressed. He was pressed down with the weight of all of our sin. So we go on to verse 40. It says, then he came to his disciples and found them asleep. And he said to Peter, what? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. He made it a very important point for his disciples at that moment, but actually it's a very important point for us always, every day, that we enter not into temptation. You know, we say in our prayer, deliver us from evil, deliver us from temptation, and let us not be delivered into evil. And this is something we should pray every day, and actually all through the day, that we don't enter into evil. We stay away from every temptation that wants to devour us. And again, it says the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Now, verse 42. Again, a second time, he went away and he prayed, saying, "Oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done." And he came and he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away, and he prayed a third time, saying these words. It's very important that we recognize that he prayed 3 times. It says here, this was the third time. The third, obviously, for one main point that it represents, is resurrection. Verse 45, Then he came to his disciples and he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners." Now, I want to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And it's very interesting because here Paul is going to speak about a prayer, and he's going to plead with the Lord, and he's going to plead in the same model that Yeshua pleaded 3 times. So it doesn't mean we plead for something and then we wait 5 minutes and we plead again, and then we wait 5 minutes and we plead again. It means we continue to plead with the Lord until we know in our hearts what the Lord's answer is. And many times, as I said at the beginning of this message, many times what we're pleading for, the answer is not going to be necessarily what we were hoping for. But that's not the point. The point is we plead because then we're in the presence of God, and we're hearing God, and we're communing with God as he gives us his answer. Just like when Yeshua was pleading with the Father, and he would have been very happy at that time, at that point, to have this cup removed. But he already knew the Father's will, and he says, "Nevertheless, your will be done." He knew that it had to happen. You know, in another place, in Isaiah, it talks about the fact that Yeshua came to Jerusalem with his face like a flint. In other words, he couldn't be moved off of this mission. His passion was to come and die on the cross. His flesh wasn't up for it. No one's flesh is up for being tortured and abused in ways that were going to happen to the Lord. The worst torture that's ever been pronounced on any person. But now, Paul here, he's going to plead as well. So 2 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning in verse 7. "A thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure." So Paul saw whatever this, many people, preachers, scholars, have tried to come up with multiple answers to what this thorn in the flesh was. But we really don't know. Some say that maybe it was his eyesight, because he mentions in other places, how big his letters were when he wrote, because he couldn't see very well. And maybe that was it, but we just don't know. Personally, I think it's something much more spiritual than something physical like eyesight, but I don't know. So we know that this thorn in the flesh was from Satan. It was something to keep him in line, so to speak. He looked at it like it was from Satan, but at the same time he was like, well, but it's okay because it keeps me from being exalted above what I think I am, and kind of being like the Pharisee we read about just a moment ago, that said, "Look how great I am," and Paul for sure didn't want to begin to think that way. So we go on into verse 8. It says, "Concerning this thing, whatever it is, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me." Notice he said 3 times. He pleaded with the Lord 3 times. The same amount of times that the Lord himself pleaded with the Father in the garden. "And he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I would rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Messiah may rest upon me." So, and then another place, doesn't it say, "I can do all things through Messiah who strengthens me," or who gives me strength? So our strength, we should never look at it as coming from ourselves. When we feel weak, then we can be the strongest, because then we can totally depend totally upon the Lord. What does it say in Isaiah? I will renew my strength. I will mount up as with wings on eagles. So when you're weak, when you're walking, you faint, all those things that it says in that verse, it can be turned totally around by just trusting in the Lord. That's where we need to be right now. In this season of time, in this season of history, where we have all these infirmities and all these problems coming upon us, where do we need to look for? How do we look through a mask? Look through social distancing? No. The answer is in the Lord. The answer for our problems is in the Lord only. And trust in the Lord. And lean not on our own understanding. Because when we're doing all these things that we think are helping us, and many times they're not helping us, then we're looking and leaning on human understanding and not understanding of the Lord. Verse 10, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses for Messiah's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And this is exactly where we need to be in this present darkness where we're in. We need to be totally realizing that we are weak. We have nothing apart from the Lord himself. And I will end with this. Philippians chapter 4, verse 6. Do not be anxious about anything, but by prayer and earnest pleading, together with thanksgiving, let your request unreservedly be made known in the presence of God. So go before the Lord, constantly pleading, constantly asking him. But really, I think the thing we should be pleading the most for of all is, Lord, let me be close to you. Let me be near to you. Show me how that I can hear you better. Show me how I can obey you better. Show me how I can know you better. And just be with me through all of this until I'm with you in eternity. In his mighty name, amen. So God bless you. I'll pray you have a wonderful week in the Lord. Until next time, God bless.